There is a grave in Sleepy Hollow, New York, marked by a rough Celtic cross, no bigger than the ones around it. No gate, no guard, no mansion behind it, because there is no mansion left. His family sold it decades ago, because keeping it up cost more than they had. The man buried there once controlled more money than most countries. When he died, his checking account held almost nothing. That was the plan. Somewhere between the richest man alive and this quiet headstone, Andrew Carnegie decided that dying rich was the one failure he refused to allow. Here's the part almost nobody expects. He pulled it off. Andrew Carnegie arrived in the United States in 1848, a 12-year-old immigrant from Dunfermline, Scotland, whose family had been driven out by the collapse of the handloom weaving trade. He started as a bobbin boy in a cotton mill, earning about $1.20 a week. He climbed telegraph messenger, telegraph operator, railroad superintendent, and along the way he learned the single skill that made him a fortune. He could see where an industry was about to explode before anyone else did. Iron. Bridges. Then steel. By the 1870s, he had built the Carnegie Steel Company into the most efficient producer on earth, obsessed with cost-cutting, vertical integration, and the brutal math of scale. He owned the mines that fed the furnaces and the railroads that moved the ore, and he crushed competitors who couldn't match his prices. Where other steelmakers upgraded equipment reluctantly, Carnegie tore out barely depreciated machinery the moment something faster came along, a habit rivals thought reckless until his margins proved otherwise. It made him staggeringly rich. It also produced Homestead, the 1892 strike at his Pennsylvania plant that turned violent when Pinkerton agents clashed with workers, leaving several dead. Carnegie was in Scotland when it happened, having left the dirty work to his partner Henry Clay Frick. He would spend the rest of his life a little haunted by it, and more than one biographer has noted that his later, almost compulsive generosity is hard to fully separate from that guilt, even though Carnegie himself rarely admitted the connection outright. As Finney likes to say, nothing sharpens a man's conscience quite like a fortune he can't quite look at directly. By 1901, Carnegie was 65 and ready to be done. J.P. Morgan wanted his company badly enough to send an intermediary, Charles Schwab, to make the approach. Carnegie thought it over for one night and wrote a number on a piece of paper, $480 million. Morgan didn't negotiate. He looked at the figure and said, "I accept this price." The deal folded Carnegie Steel into the new U.S. Steel Corporation, the first billion-dollar company in American history, and made Andrew Carnegie, by most estimates, the richest private individual on the planet. Now here's where you'd expect the story to turn. This is usually the part where the founder buys the yacht, builds the 50-room cottage, starts arranging marriages into European titles. Stop and ask yourself something before we go further. What do you actually think happens to a fortune that size when the man who built it has already decided, years earlier, that he despises the idea of passing it down? Hold that thought, because it's going to matter more than the sale price ever will. Because here's a detail worth sitting with. The name on the wall of that concert hall you've probably heard of, Carnegie Hall, and the university whose computer science program you've probably heard mentioned in the same breath as MIT or Stanford, Carnegie Mellon, and the library in whatever mid-sized American town you grew up in that still has his name carved over the door. None of those exist because an heir kept the business running. They exist because Andrew Carnegie built an entirely different kind of machine, one designed to give the fortune away faster than his family could inherit it. That's the twist in this story. The empire didn't get passed down. It got dismantled on purpose by the man who built it, and what's left standing today isn't a family. It's several thousand buildings with his name on them. We'll get to exactly how he pulled that off. Keep that in your back pocket. This wasn't a late-life conversion, either, and it's worth being precise about that, because Carnegie's own words on the subject predate his fortune's peak by more than a decade. In 1889, at the height of his wealth-building years, he published an essay in the North American Review that would come to be known as the Gospel of Wealth. In it, he argued that a rich man was essentially a trustee, not an owner, that fortunes above what a family reasonably needed belonged, morally, to the public, and that the rich had an obligation to distribute them during their own lifetime rather than at death. He wrote, bluntly, that a man who dies rich dies disgraced. Finney's take? Most rich men write their will to protect the family name. This one wrote an essay to threaten it. So let's name the actual mechanism at work here, because it's the real thesis of this episode, and it's different from almost every other fortune we've covered on this channel. This isn't a story about a dynasty that collapsed because nobody built a trust, or a holding company, or a family office to protect the money once the founder was gone. It's the mirror image of that. Carnegie deliberately refused to build any of those structures for his heirs. No dynastic trust. No multi-generational holding vehicle designed to keep control inside the bloodline. Instead, he built philanthropic infrastructure, the Carnegie Corporation of New York, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, the Carnegie Institution, and more, engineered for exactly one purpose: to move the money out of the family and into the public before it could calcify into a dynasty. Where most fortunes die from the absence of a structural vehicle, this one survived, as an idea, if not as a family fortune, because Carnegie built the vehicle specifically to prevent inheritance, not preserve it. Compare that, for a second, to what was happening one rung up the Gilded Age ladder at almost exactly the same time. John D. Rockefeller, Carnegie's rival in wealth, if not in temperament, built the Rockefeller family trusts with the opposite goal: preserve capital and control across generations while still funding philanthropy through the foundation. More than a century later, the Rockefeller family is still recognizably wealthy, still meets as a family office, still sits on boards. Carnegie looked at exactly that model, dynastic wealth wrapped in a philanthropic bow, and rejected it on principle. He didn't want a family that stayed rich forever. He wanted a family that was comfortable, and a fortune that was gone. If you're the kind of person who likes watching what happens when a founder's personal philosophy collides head-on with the machinery of inherited wealth, whether it survives, whether it backfires, whether the heirs quietly undo it after the funeral, that's more or less the entire premise of this channel. Subscribe, and you'll catch the next one before it goes up. Carnegie's giving wasn't scattershot charity, either, and this matters, because sloppy giving is easy to romanticize and hard to verify. He treated philanthropy the way he treated steel production, systematically, at scale, with clear metrics. Between 1901 and his death in 1919, he distributed roughly $350 million, something like 90% of his total fortune, to schools, universities, libraries, and international peace initiatives. The single largest and most visible piece of that was libraries. Carnegie ultimately funded the construction of more than 1,600 public libraries across the United States, and several hundred more across Britain, Canada, and other English-speaking countries, at a total cost of around $60 million. He attached a condition to almost every one of them, and the condition tells you everything about how his mind worked. The town had to agree to fund the library's ongoing operation itself, usually by committing tax dollars to staff, books, and upkeep in perpetuity. Carnegie would pay to build it. He would not pay to run it. Plenty of towns actually turned the money down rather than accept the obligation, which is itself a detail that undercuts the idea that this was simply free money nobody could refuse. In the Gospel of Wealth, he'd written that charity should help those who help themselves. And the library grants were that philosophy turned into architecture, one building at a time, in towns that had never had one before. It wasn't charity in the sense of a check written and forgotten. It was closer to a franchise agreement, with civic pride and a town's own tax base standing in as collateral. As Finney would put it, the man built you a library, but he made you promise to keep the lights on. That's not generosity. That's generosity with homework attached. There's a detail from Carnegie's private papers that gets repeated constantly in profiles of him, and it deserves the caveat it rarely gets. A note, reportedly written when he was 33, in which he laid out a plan to earn a fixed income each year and give away everything beyond it, warning himself against the corrupting effect of chasing money for its own sake. This memo is frequently quoted as though its exact wording and date are settled fact. Historians generally treat it as authentic to Carnegie's private papers, but the precise circumstances of when he wrote it are less airtight than the retellings suggest. Even so, whatever its exact provenance, it captures something that's hard to dispute. Decades before he had the fortune to give away, Carnegie was already rehearsing the discomfort of having one. By his own death in August 1919, at 83, Carnegie had given away roughly 9/10 of everything he'd made. What remained, about $30 million, the bulk of what was left, went in his will to the Carnegie Corporation, the foundation he'd already spent years building out, with instructions to keep giving after he was gone. He did not die with nothing, not literally. But he died having failed, deliberately and almost completely, at the one thing every other fortune on this channel exists to protect, keeping the money in the family. Finney has a phrase for this one: Most founders build an empire and hope it survives them. This one built an empire specifically so it wouldn't. So what happened to the family that was left holding what remained? This is usually the part of the story where an heir either salvages the fortune or spectacularly burns through it, and neither one happened here, because there wasn't enough fortune left to do either. Carnegie's only child, Margaret, received a trust that kept her comfortable, not wealthy in any dynastic sense. She and her husband eventually had to sell the family's Manhattan mansion because its upkeep outpaced what the trust could cover. Her descendants, Carnegie's great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren, now numbering in the dozens, mostly don't carry the Carnegie name at all, since it passed down through a daughter rather than a son. By most accounts, they live unremarkable, comfortable, professional lives. Doctors, teachers, business people, largely out of the public eye. One great-granddaughter, speaking to a reporter years ago, described the family as having lived conservatively and privately for generations, content to make their own way rather than lean on a name most people no longer connect to them personally. That's not a tragedy. That's the plan working exactly as designed. Carnegie didn't fail to build a dynasty. He specifically declined to. It's worth pausing on how unusual that actually is among fortunes this size. Almost every other family we've profiled on this channel spends generations fighting over a shrinking pool of money, hiring lawyers to contest a will, or watching a well-meaning trust get drained by a single heir's bad decisions. The Carnegies didn't have that fight because there was almost nothing left large enough to fight over. The scarcity itself was the inheritance. Which brings us back to the thing we asked you to hold on to earlier, the modern echo hiding in plain sight. The Carnegie name didn't disappear. It just stopped attaching itself to people and started attaching itself to institutions. Carnegie Hall has hosted essentially every major performer of the last century. Carnegie Mellon University turns out engineers and computer scientists who build the companies you use today. The Carnegie Library System reshaped what public access to books even meant in America, and hundreds of those original buildings, modest, sturdy, stone-fronted, are still standing, still lending books, more than 100 years later. The Carnegie Corporation, the foundation he seeded with his final fortune, is still active, still funding education and international affairs work right now, in 2026. The empire didn't vanish. It just stopped belonging to anyone named Carnegie. Finney's closing thought on this one. Every other fortune on this channel asks how long a family can hold on to the money. This is the only one that asks what happens when the founder decides the answer should be not very long, on purpose, and somehow still wins. Here's the lesson underneath all of it, and it's a stranger one than philanthropy is nice. Carnegie's real bet wasn't that giving money away was virtuous. It was that concentrated, inherited wealth, left to sit for generations inside one bloodline, tends to rot the people who receive it more than it enriches them. He said as much explicitly. That dynastic fortunes rob heirs of purpose, and that an estate tax on the wealthy was, in his words, the wisest form of taxation there was, because it punished what he saw as a failure of nerve on the dead man's part. Whether you think he was right is genuinely up for debate. Plenty of families have built structures that preserved wealth across generations without producing the ruin Carnegie predicted. But he was consistent. He put his own fortune where his argument was, and when he died, there wasn't much of it left to argue about. If you've made it this far, here's what I actually want to know. Of every family this channel has covered, the ones who lost it all by accident and the one who lost it all completely on purpose, which approach do you think actually protects a family better in the long run? Tell me in the comments, and tell me which fortune you want Finney digging through next. Until then, a fortune doesn't have to fall to disappear. Sometimes it just gets given away, one library at a time, exactly as planned.